Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. David Hume is classified among the British empiricist philosophers, oftentimes in the lineage of Locke and Berkeley and Hume placed at the end, although of course there were many empiricists after Hume as well, just none quite so famous, we could say. And you can see this empiricism, which we're going to talk about in just a moment, showing itself very clearly at the end of section 2 of his Enquiry Concerning Human Understanding, where he derives a sort of rule that is, quite helpful in many cases and is also emblematic of what it means to be an empiricist. So let's talk first about what we typically mean when we're referencing this notion of empiricism. It often gets presented as if the empiricist, what defines him or her is that they believe that all ideas or all things within our mind, all knowledge is coming from the outside, from experience of the external world. That's not actually technically correct for any of the empiricists, in part because we also have internal sensations and perceptions and passions, and Hume thinks that those play a very important role. We can have impressions of our own internal states, like, for example, getting angry, the feeling of what it's like to be angry, or he's got, the example of cruelty or generosity or friendship, all of those sorts of things. So we have to widen it, and we have to then say, all right, it's experience in general that is the source of all of the ideas in our mind, and therefore of any knowledge that we have. It has to be, if not necessarily of the external world, at least of, the external world plus the internal, if we want to call it world, or whatever it happens to be, that we are. And that's not bad. That's a good way to understand empiricism. But we can also talk about an empiricist project. Why insist so much on this? Well, because as we see with Hume, as we've also seen with other thinkers before him, there's a sense in which empiricism is going to clarify things that people have been all mixed up about in the past. And so Hume is using this to target unclear ideas that correspond primarily, he thinks, just to terms. And he's using this to attack what we might call abstractions that people engage in and deal with. If it was today, we might think in terms of ideologies or stereotypes or all sorts of things along those lines. In his time, he's talking about philosophical terms that people use without having a clear idea about what it is that these terms refer to. And so we can think of empiricism as not merely an assertion about where our ideas and therefore our knowledge comes from, but also as an insistence that we apply a rule that, at least in some cases, says, well, where are these ideas coming from? Show me the experience or experiences from which you're deriving this, or what you're talking about probably is not really the case. As a matter of fact, it might not even be real ideas that you're working with. They may just be, as Plato back in the Theaetetus called certain conceptions wind eggs, sort of miscarriages of the use of the mind. So, what does Hume tell us at the end? Let's actually look at the text here. He says that here's a proposition which not only seems in itself simple and intelligible, but if a proper use were made of it, would render every dispute equally intelligible and banish all of that jargon which has so long taken possession of metaphysical reasonings and drawn disgrace upon them. So what we've got here is clearly an agenda, a philosophical agenda to clarify the things that people are getting into interminable disputes and discussions about. This is the old, dream of philosophy. If we could just get our ideas and our terms clear, everything would fall into place. So he says, all ideas, here's a key thing about ideas. All ideas, especially abstract ones, are naturally faint and obscure. The mind has but a slender hold on them. They are apt to be confounded with other resembling ideas, and when we have often employed any term, though without a distinct meaning, we are apt to imagine it has a determinate idea annexed to it. So we've got a lot of different components here in this very short paragraph. Ideas are naturally faint and obscure. They're not as strong as impressions. So, again, if we want to use Hume's example of anger, it's one thing to feel anger, to be in the situation. It's another to talk about it. And when people start talking about it, the ideas sometimes get a little bit hazy, actually a lot hazy, according to Hume. They're apt to be confused with similar ideas. In terms of the passions, we might talk about the likelihood of people in discussions confusing anger with hatred, or confusing anger with indignation, or confusing anger with aggressivity, or all of these other sorts of things, right? People often do get into very strange discussions about these. They're apt to be confused with similar ideas. If we're talking about the notion of physical force, maybe we confuse that with the notion of our wills, as Hume is going to talk about later on in this inquiry as well. He says that this is especially so for abstract ideas. And we ought to think, well, what are abstract ideas? So, simple ideas are that, like the yellowish, I guess you could call it goldenrod of this book, combined with the black and all these letters and stuff like that. This book is already a rather complex thing that you might be looking at or hearing me describe. That yellow is a simple idea. You can look at it and now try to visualize it in your mind. And the longer you get away from actually having seen it, perhaps the fuzzier it gets and the more confused. It's easy to mix it up with another yellow or even the white of the chalk on the chalkboard. Abstract ideas aren't the sort of perceptions that we're talking about here of individual objects or sensible states. Instead, they're ideas that we form precisely by taking a bunch of ideas, ideas derived from impressions, and then sort of distilling out a kind of common essence to them, at least in theory. Sometimes abstract ideas might just be things that we've heard about and have never actually experienced. And we hear people talking about them, and we kind of form a conception of them, and we think we know what we're dealing with. And this is where we get into trouble, right? When we use terms, as Hume says, we imagine that there is a determinate idea attached to those terms. So there's all sorts of possible examples of this. Hume talks about, the idea of like the occult properties hidden behind the phenomena that we're seeing, like those of force or elasticity, right? We don't actually know what these are when we get down to it. Or, even the conception of the will is a little bit hazy for us, isn't it? It helps when we consider actual willing. When we imagine that there's a determinate idea just because there's a word corresponding to it, that's when we run into all sorts of problems and difficulties. And we might think of countless examples in our own time in the present. Think about our entire virtual world and the ideas that we use to describe it. Think about code, for example, right? Code is something that, strictly speaking, we only observe tiny little portions of. Most of us never look at any code whatsoever and use things that rely upon code, and we talk about it as if we actually understand what the hell we're talking about. And we've got the haziest conception of what code might actually consist in. And there's many, many different kinds of codes, right? We can abstract something out of it. And, if we want to be really, sticklers, well, they all reduce down to machine language, just a bunch of logic circuits. Well, yeah, I guess so. I mean, have you ever observed all those sorts of things? Have you spent a lot of time digging around in those and looking at them? I mean, we can go on and on and on about this sort of example, but we can multiply many other examples as well. Impressions, Hume says, are very different. They are strong, they're vivid, and a key idea that corresponds to the obscure, impressions are actually distinct from each other. He says the limits between them are more exactly determined, nor is it easy to fall into any mistake or error with regard to them. So this, distinction between impressions and ideas. Ideas are really easy to get mixed up, especially when they're abstract. Especially when we've got terms floating around that we're using for them as sort of a substitute for actually thinking about them. Impressions, not so much. Those are the things we directly experience. We can derive a rule. Whenever, now notice Hume doesn't say whenever any term, he says whenever a philosophical term is used without any meaning or idea. Now, we're going to have to clarify that a little bit, but just go with me on that. We can ask ourselves this following question. What impression is the idea derived from? He says, if it's impossible to assign any, this will serve to confirm our suspicion. By bringing ideas in so clear a light, we may reasonably hope to remove all dispute which may arise concerning their nature and reality. Now, we should ask ourselves, what would it actually mean for a philosophical term to be used without any meaning whatsoever? Is that really possible? Is it really possible not to have any idea attached to it? And the answer is probably no. But we could say, the meaning or idea is more or less vague, more or less easy to confuse with others, hard to specify. And if that's the case, if we can't actually trace it to some sort of impressions, then maybe the idea really is not something we should be relying upon, let alone saying corresponds to some sort of reality, right? Because remember, ideas are at best sort of replicas or representations of what's supposed to be out there or what we're directly experiencing in here. So we want to, be a little bit careful about this, but we can use it, and this is what the empiricists do over and over again. They'll say, all right, you're using these terms over here. What do they correspond to? What are you actually talking about that we can observe in the world and then turn our attention to, or observe in ourselves and by introspection turn our attention to? What do you actually have in mind? And it's not a bad rule. One thing we do have to keep in mind is that some ideas are in fact produced by using the imagination, as Hume, did an example of, or several examples of, in this very section. He says that the creative power of the mind includes this faculty of compounding, transposing, augmenting, diminishing the materials offered to us by the senses and experience. So, in the case of Golden Mountain, you can actually have an idea of this, and it's a pretty clear idea, but you can't find a golden mountain in reality, or a virtuous horse, or some of the other things. But for a lot of things that people get into disputes about, like discussions about freedom or goodness, or, again, code, right? Or efficiency, maybe we want to ask, what impressions, what things out there in the world or in us that we can actually point to and share as experiences, what are we actually talking about here? That's how Hume thinks we ought to proceed when it comes to our ideas and our impressions. in this empiricist manner.